Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about how good people become bad leaders. Now, let me be clear here. That's a little bit of a trying to suck you into my episode because that's not how it works, right? It's not like good people become bad. The more nuanced way of saying is basically how does power corrupt and move people away from their values? There are certainly pretty not so great leaders out there that are not in it for the quote unquote right reasons. But that's not what we're talking about here because, in my experience, more often than not, when leaders are ineffective, it is not because they're fundamentally bad people, but something happened to them on their journey into a position of power. So, to me, I think the usual issue at hand here is at the end of the day, perhaps unsurprising, knowing I'm a psychodynamic provider and practitioner, is it's an ego issue. It's an ego issue. I think this is why the notion of humility has been hit so hard, so frequently. It's become almost kind of cliche. It's like, well, everybody needs to be a humble leader. Well, why does that even matter? And then how are people led astray, essentially? Well, the reason why it matters is when we look at basic fundamentals around power dynamics with people, we project a lot onto people in positions of power, and our relationships with people of power are pretty diverse and pretty varied. There are some people, because of their past and or personalities, they tend to buck and kind of push against systems of power. This includes cultural experiences, and there are those that are kind of overly wed and will ingratiate themselves to people in positions of power. And that creates a lot for a person in a position of power to hold. I mean, it is rightfully very difficult to contain. And because that is difficult to contain, what the human condition typically does is it wants to default to whatever is the easiest way to operate. And the easiest way to operate is to avoid conflict and to select for and support initiatives and experiences that lend themselves towards peace and harmony rather than conflict. This also linked to the idea and the sort of underlying belief or notion or relationship that somehow conflict is not productive. And a fear often of not measuring up should conflict occur. What happens if conflict occurs and things start to spiral? Well, guess who's responsible at the end of the day? Guess who has the most power and can be pointed to as a responsible party in how things have gone south? It's the leader. It's the leader. And so ego is at stake. Ego is at stake in that sort of dynamic. And it is not uncommon, out of self-preservation, not malignant narcissism, not all this stuff that we like to put on to people just because they're ineffective. But it is normal human behavior to get away from our higher cortical functions and move towards things that engender a sense of safety. Unfortunately, when we talk about leadership, the things that are safer are often antithetical to effective leadership. And thus, the trap is set. And so the more humble, aka the more curious, in my opinion, and aka the more self-aware, the more curious we are with ourselves, typically the more self-aware we are, the better we tend to operate as a leader, because then we can kind of encounter people wherever they are at and understand where they are at and pick and choose how we might respond. And I think one of the notions here, unfortunately, when people are like, well, I need to lead, is I need to be right and I need to make sure everything goes well. That is not the role of a leader. The role of a leader is to facilitate and to get sort of a breadth of experiences and a breadth of perceptions to inform the decisions that you make, and understand when you make those decisions, you will probably not make everybody happy. And that is the reality. Now, there are different tools, things that I'm not going to go into and I don't have time to go into, as far as how you navigate that efficiently. But that sort of being humble about oneself and saying, hey, I can do wrong and I don't know everything, as well as the humility to say, I know I'm going to not always do things that are, preferred. That's my burden, right? Like, I have to make the decision, even if that decision ends up hurting some people or is difficult or, whatever. And again, there are ways to frame and couch this when you understand and can anticipate that this might not land terribly well. And instead, people move towards over control. I'm not going to hear people out, because if I hear people out, I'm going to disappoint more people. There's no way I can get to this sort of illusory consensus to make everybody happy. Oh, and by the way, I want the outcome to look good for me. Again, this is not necessarily consciously like, ha ha ha, Mr. Burns, excellent, right? This is not necessarily what they're doing. It's just like, I want this to go well. I want this to go well. I want to be a good leader. I want to be liked as a leader. I want to be successful as a leader. And that becomes more important than encountering people and encountering systems with curiosity and humility. And this is the beginning of the end as far as effective leadership. I shouldn't say the end. I mean, there's still always a path towards redemption. But this is often what steers leaders into these defensive positions, and creates an inadvertent us versus them mentality. Now, there are people who, again, will continue to ingratiate themselves and act out of fear, to make sure they'll go wherever the leader tells them. And the leader will kind of use that as evidence for how they are effective. The people who struggle with leadership, whether it's their own kind of personal issues or, heaven forbid, there's actually a legitimate issue going on in the system, whether it's an administrative process issue or it's a culture issue, and they will use that as like, you're an outlier, you're a naysayer, you're a bad apple, you're poisoning the well. And in doing so, they other that group of people, which creates dissatisfaction. And with that dissatisfaction, they get upset and they usually revert to over control. And then what happens? You've got a sect of a company, a sect of a team that is no longer content and is disempowered to say anything, because the person in power is squelching them out of their own self-protection. And then there's usually an escape route, people that they can point to and say, well, they don't think I'm bad, they seem to be doing good, and that means I don't have to listen to the rest of this. And then the system gets stuck. And this is how a well-intentioned leader can become, in effect, not that I'm a super big fan of the term good and bad, the black and the white, but how they can become a not so good, aka bad leader. So this is oversimplified. Again, there are lots of layers to it, but that's just kind of a quick and dirty in case it's helpful to hear the kind of process that I see. The well-intentioned, but the ego gets the best of the process. Before they know it, they're sucked into a little bit of a black hole and operating, and then they can get really stuck, and it's hard to get unstuck. So, again, left a lot out there, but as always, appreciate folks listening and or watching, and stay curious.